Imagine you are handed the economic blueprint of an entire nation.
Right, a whole country's data set.
Exactly. But your job isn't to, write a 30-page report about it. Your job is to draw it.
Which is an incredibly daunting task, honestly.
It really is. Using only pure white space, gray lines, and absolute minimalism, you have to visually prove how an isolated, literally freezing rock in the North Atlantic with the population of like a medium-sized American suburb managed to build a $60,000 per capita wealth engine.
Yeah, Iceland's trajectory is wild.
It's totally wild. So welcome to the deep dive. Grab your drafting board because today we are speaking directly to you, our listener.
The senior data visualization designer tasked with this exact mission.
Yep, this is all for you. And it is a phenomenal design challenge. I mean, you were looking at a massive, multi-decade, multi-dimensional macroeconomic data set of Iceland.
And, the instinct when faced with that much data is usually to just build a massive dashboard.
Oh, totally. A riot of colors, overlapping bar graphs, interactive toggles everywhere.
Right, the classic sensory overload approach. You just point at the visual chaos and say, well, there it is. There's the economy.
Yeah, but for this high-stakes academic presentation you're building, that flashy approach is completely useless. You are operating under really strict aesthetic rules today.
Very strict. We are talking stark, clinical white backgrounds.
And your color palette is severely restricted to low-saturation Morandi colors. So like cool slate, dark gray blue, maybe a muted iron green if you really need emphasis.
Yeah, absolutely zero flashy three-dimensional effects, no 3D pie charts. Everything must be flat, two-dimensional graphics.
The goal here is high information density through just relentless minimalism.
Exactly. If you need to show a trend, you use a fine, crisp line. If you need to highlight a data convergence, you use a semi-transparent gray circle.
Right. The viewer should be able to read the core logic of Iceland's entire national model just by looking at the geometry on your slides. They shouldn't even need you in the room.
That's the ultimate test of a good data visualization. It has to be self-evident.
So to help you build that geometry, we're going to extract the overarching narrative from your sources today. Because Iceland's trajectory isn't just a random list of economic stats.
No, not at all. It is a story of extreme survival and hyper-optimization.
The goal of our time today is to extract the core logic of what we're calling Iceland's positive feedback loop. And just a quick reminder, this isn't your standard deep dive where we just chat about a topic. This is your personal audio drafting board.
We are essentially looking at a machine. A closed-loop system where high education, combined with governance transparency and fueled by 100% green electricity, creates an environment for high-value services.
And every output becomes the input for the next phase of growth.
Precisely. It feeds itself.
So let's start sketching this out mentally. Picture your very first slide. It is a pristine white canvas.
It's a great starting point.
Right in the center, or maybe offset slightly to the right, you have a minimalist map of Iceland. But we don't want a standard geographical map.
No, that's too conventional.
Let's make it out of tiny, perfectly spaced gray data dots. And just the capital region, Reykjavik, is subtly glowing in a deep, cool blue.
I like that. That immediately establishes the foundational thesis. Because Iceland is a hyper-open micro-island economy.
Right.
Geographically, it is completely isolated, but economically, it is deeply embedded in the global system. Its success is intensely structural. It's not accidental.
But how do we visualize that structure around the map? I'm looking at the data, and we have these four distinct pillars, right? Macroeconomy, social capital, green energy, and national governance.
Yes, those are the core components.
If I'm building a standard data model, it is incredibly tempting to just draw four siloed squares, like put the GDP chart in one box, the education stats in another.
Which would be a fundamental misrepresentation of the mechanics at play here.
Really? Why?
You cannot visualize these as separate buckets. They need to be rendered as a continuous gray central axis, a through line that connects absolutely everything.
Okay, let's unpack this. I have to push back on that, though, purely from a modeling perspective. Are they really a continuous axis?
They are.
Because if I hypothetically touch the education slider, does the economy metric automatically and directly shift? How tight is that correlation in reality? It feels, I don't know, a bit too perfect.
With the velocity of cause and effect in a microeconomy is unlike anything you see in larger nations.
How so?
When your total population is hovering around a few 100,000 people, investments in human capital like education immediately and visibly reduce institutional friction.
Okay, that makes sense.
Let's trace the mechanism, right? Better educated citizens demand and create better, more transparent governance. That transparent governance, specifically the rule of law, directly fuels foreign investment.
Ah, and that leads to the transition to high-value services.
Exactly. Those services boost the macroeconomy, which generates the massive tax revenue required to pay for, you guessed it, more education.
Wow, okay, it really does feed itself. So on this first slide, maybe those four pillars are icons connected by a literal loop drawn in a very fine, dark gray-blue stroke.
That's a great way to show the audience that we aren't looking at isolated phenomena, we are looking at an engine.
And to understand how that engine generates power, we have to look at the fuel. We need to examine the people themselves.
Right, the human capital.
That means our next slide needs to visualize time and human lives. Picture a beautiful, flat, stacked area chart. We are plotting a long-term crossover in the demographics.
Always a crucial metric.
On one side, we have the 0 to 14 age bracket. On the other, the 65 and older bracket.
The historical context here is critical for your audience to grasp. Over the long term, that 0 to 14 age demographic has experienced a massive downward trend.
Like how massive are we talking?
Historically, this bracket sat up around 34% of the population. A full third of the country were children.
Wow, a third.
But that line sweeps drastically downward over the decades, heading toward the low single digits.
So you have this solid area of slate gray representing the youth, just sweeping downward from left to right. Meanwhile, the 65-plus demographic marches steadily upward, crossing the 14% threshold.
Exactly.
As a designer, this is where you use a semi-transparent gray circle to highlight the exact moment on the chart where these two lines approach each other, that convergence zone.
What's fascinating here is what you are highlighting in that convergence zone. It's a classic modern demographic transition.
Right, the societal burden is fundamentally shifting.
Yes. Instead of society's resources being heavily consumed by raising children, building primary schools, funding pediatric care, the mathematical burden shifts to supporting an aging population.
We are talking about pensions, elder care facilities, chronic disease management.
Precisely.
And usually when you see those two lines cross on a graph for a developed nation, it is the harbinger of a massive economic crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
The workforce shrinks, the tax base collapses, and healthcare costs just skyrocket. You end up with a totally top-heavy society.
Yet, the overall population data for Iceland tells a slightly different story. They maintain a slight positive overall population growth.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they're not shrinking into a demographic winter like we see in several other highly developed nations.
But if the burden is shifting to the elderly, and the youth population is shrinking relative to the whole, how do they keep the economic engine from stalling out? Where did they find the human power?
It's a great question.
They clearly didn't just import it all.
No, the math dictated that they had to unlock the total productive power of the adult population they already had. They maximized the people of working age. And the primary mechanism for that was achieving absolute gender parity in the workforce.
This requires a highly specific visual layout. For this slide, let's split that stark white canvas right down the middle.
Okay, a split screen approach.
Yeah. On the left, a minimalist horizontal bar chart showing government education expenditure. And on the right, a dual-line graph tracking male versus female labor force participation.
The left side of your slide represents capacity building. Government education spending in Iceland stubbornly stays in a very high, very narrow bracket.
What are the numbers there?
Between 4% and 7.6% of their entire GDP.
That is a staggering, sustained commitment. It isn't just a one-time stimulus. It's a permanent structural cost.
Right, and the yield on that investment is universal primary school completion. For both boys and girls, the completion rate is practically universal, sitting between 90 and 100%.
That's incredible.
The dropout rate is virtually non-existent. They are pouring a huge percentage of their national wealth into creating an incredibly high baseline of human capital.
Okay, so we render that bar chart on the left in our muted iron green to really show that investment. Now let's look at the dual line graph on the right.
This is where the demographic strategy really shows up.
And this is where I want to focus on the designer's challenge. Most charts plotting male and female labor participation show a stubborn, wide gap. The lines might run parallel, but the female line is almost always significantly lower. But for this Icelandic data, the lines behave differently, don't they?
They do. The Gender Parity Index, or GPI, in labor participation sits incredibly high. It consistently hovers over 90%.
Wow.
Female employment stays above 65 to 70%. Furthermore, the data shows women rising steadily in management and employer roles, not just occupying entry-level positions.
So the designer needs to point a fine, dark gray arrow precisely at the tiny gap that remains between the two lines on the right side of the chart.
Yes, it's a convergence gap.
The lines are practically hugging each other. It's almost a flat line of equality. But here's where it gets really interesting. Let me challenge the underlying assumption here.
Sure, go ahead.
If I just pump 7.6% of GDP into schools, do the lines on the right side of the slide automatically converge? Like, does education funding directly equal workforce integration?
Not inherently, no. The
Yeah.
spending we see on the left side of your slide provides the capacity. It creates a population of highly skilled, capable workers. But social infrastructure is what provides the access.
Okay, break down that mechanism for me. How does social infrastructure translate to those converging lines?
Think of it this way. You can educate a woman to the highest possible academic standard. But if the societal structure forces her to choose between maintaining a career and having a family, your labor participation lines will never converge.
That makes perfect sense.
Iceland's mechanism for access involves universal maternal and paternal care, heavily subsidized childcare, and deeply ingrained societal norms around shared domestic labor.
Ah, so it's systemic.
Entirely.
Hmm.
They engineered the social safety net specifically to ensure that the massive investment they made in educating women wasn't lost to the economy when those women decided to have children.
For a microeconomy facing that aging demographic we just looked at, failing to utilize 50% of the workforce would literally be economic suicide.
Absolutely.
You can't have half your highly educated population sitting at home when you have a growing elderly population to support.
You just don't have the numbers to sustain it.
So as a designer, you could add a small, well-kerned text annotation near that convergence gap on the right. Maybe something like capacity via expenditure plus access via social infrastructure.
That makes the slide's logic airtight. And when a society values human life and human capital to that extreme degree, it doesn't just manifest in labor statistics.
Where else does it show up?
It manifests as the sheer biological ability to keep citizens alive. They end up pushing against the theoretical limits of modern medicine.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's abandon lines and bars for a moment to visualize this. I'm picturing a step-down chart for mortality rates.
A step-down chart is perfect for this.
It starts high on the left and literally steps down like a staircase until it hits the floor and practically rides the x-axis.
Right.
And next to it, a structural tree map, which uses nested rectangles to show proportions.
The step-down chart illustrates a stunning public health achievement. Infant mortality and under 5 mortality rates have plummeted to absolute extremes.
How extreme?
Dropping to less than 2 per 1,000 live births.
2 out of 1,000. That line literally hits the floor and just stops. There is mathematically almost no more room to drop.
Similarly, maternal mortality is practically 0 across multiple long-term tracking periods.
That's amazing.
Because of their dense, highly funded healthcare infrastructure and the geographic concentration of their medical resources, they have essentially solved early mortality for vulnerable populations.
Which is incredible, but it creates a visual problem for the right side of the slide.
How so?
If nobody is dying young, what are we showing in the tree map?
You are showing the paradox of a highly successful medical system. The tree map needs to highlight non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
When you stop people from dying young from preventable causes, infectious diseases, or childbirth complications, they live long enough to die from chronic age-related conditions.
Oh, I see. So the tree map is dominated by massive blocks representing heart disease, cancer, and respiratory illnesses.
Exactly. This is a late-stage epidemiological shift. Health interventions in Iceland now strictly focus on chronic disease management for a population that routinely lives into their 80s.
So the mortality data isn't showing a failure of the health system.
Not at all. It's showing the ultimate success of it. People are living long enough to experience the diseases of old age.
On your slide, you have the flatline infant mortality on the left in hard slate gray and this heavy, dense block of NCDs on the right.
It's a powerful contrast.
You are visually communicating. We solve the beginning of life, now we must manage the end. But managing the end of life, treating chronic NCDs for decades, is astronomically expensive.
Which is the pivot point for the entire macroeconomic model.
Right.
If you have a highly educated, long-living, gender-equal population, they require a very high standard of living. You need an economy that generates enough wealth to pay for those massive education budgets and the advanced long-term health care for chronic diseases.
Let's look at the wealth generation engine then. We need a wide, smooth trend line stretching across the next slide, tracking GDP per capita in constant 2015 US dollars.
Okay, tracking the overall wealth.
It starts low on the left at around $14,000 and moves upward toward nearly $60,000. That is a fundamental structural transformation of national wealth.
However, that line is not a smooth, easy climb. The data features extreme volatility.
Right, and here's where the designer has to make a tough choice. Around the 2008 financial crisis, the line drops so dramatically that if I just draw it normally, it might look like a rendering error.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, small, open island economies are incredibly exposed to global shocks. You must highlight the crash, because the recovery from that crash is the defining feature of their modern economic resilience.
So I shouldn't smooth it out.
Definitely not. The 2008 drop isn't just a dip, it's an economic hard reset. Think of it like a massive forest fire that burns away the bloated underbrush in this case, an incredibly over-leveraged banking sector.
Right, the Icelandic banking crisis was huge news.
Exactly. That fire clears the canopy, allowing a completely different ecosystem to grow in its ashes.
So I'll use a massive shaded gray dashed box to contain that 2008 drop. But immediately after the box, we draw an aggressive, thick upward arrow showing the line skyrocketing again. How did they pull out of that nosedive so effectively?
The recovery was driven by a massive structural pivot to high-value, high-productivity services. The underlying wealth generation engine was never permanently broken by 2008. It just reconfigured itself.
Okay, so the data shows that the service sector now dominates 60 to 70% of Iceland's entire GDP.
Yeah.
To visualize that reconfiguration, I want you to include a stark waterfall chart next to the GDP trend line. A waterfall chart is perfect for showing how one category effectively absorbs others over time.
That's a great visual tool for this.
You can visually show the service sector maybe rendered in a cool blue, effectively swallowing agriculture and basic manufacturing over the decades.
The mechanism here is vital, though. It wasn't just an expansion of low-level services. They didn't recover by opening more local restaurants or dry cleaners.
What kind of services then?
The service sector value added per worker, the actual economic output of an individual in that sector skyrocketed from around $5,900 to an exponential high.
But wait, how do a bunch of fishermen and displaced bankers suddenly become high-value service workers?
That goes back to the capacity we discussed earlier.
The education spending.
Exactly. The 7.6% of GDP spent on education meant the population was already highly trained, highly literate, and highly adaptable.
So they were ready for the pivot?
When the financial sector collapsed, that human capital rapidly shifted into software development, advanced tourism management, high-tech engineering, and green tech consulting.
Okay, the waterfall chart shows the dominance of these advanced services. But if I'm looking at this critically, a service economy on an isolated island can't survive by just selling software and engineering consulting to the other 300,000 locals.
No, the internal market is just too small to generate $60,000 per capita.
To generate that kind of wealth, they must face outward. They have to export.
Which brings us to the visual challenge of hyper-openness.
We need overlapping area and line charts here. But the defining element on this slide is a bold, horizontal dashed line cutting straight across the upper middle of the frame.
What does that line represent?
That line is your 100% reference marker.
Ah, got it. Because the data tells a story of absolute global integration. Total trade, which is imports plus exports, consistently hovers between 60% and 100% of Iceland's total GDP.
So the shaded area of the chart is constantly pushing up against or even touching that 100% dashed ceiling. And exports alone account for 30 to over 50% of their GDP.
Let's break down the mechanics of what it actually means when trade is equivalent to your entire domestic product.
Yeah, please do.
For a microstate, globalization isn't a political choice, it's basic physics.
Physics.
Yeah. Let's say an Icelandic tech firm develops a highly specialized medical software system. The research and development costs are massive. If they only sell that software within Iceland, they will never, ever recoup their investment.
Because there just aren't enough hospitals there.
Exactly. The domestic market simply lacks the scale. To achieve economies of scale, they must embed themselves deeply into global supply chains.
They have to sell to the world and buy from the world just to keep the lights on.
Furthermore, high trade dependence requires incredible international adaptability and raw competitiveness.
Right, because you are competing with everyone.
You cannot afford to be inefficient If half of your national income relies on convincing other countries to buy your goods and services over someone else's, you have to be world class, constantly innovating, constantly adapting to global shocks.
The visual takeaway here is that massive mass of gray and blue pushing up against the 100% line, showing an economy with essentially no walls.
It's totally porous.
But to compete globally like that,
Mhm.
a modern economy needs a distinct comparative advantage, something nobody else has, or at least something they have in incredible abundance.
And for Iceland, that comparative advantage quite literally erupts from the ground beneath their feet.
Which is awesome. And this leads us to what might be the most striking visual contradiction in the entire deck.
Okay, let's hear it.
I want you to design a massive, pure color ring chart. Let's use that muted iron green here to really make it distinct.
Nice.
The ring is almost entirely closed, just a tiny hairline gap at the top. And right in the negative space in the center, a single bold number, 99.9%.
That number represents their electricity grid. 99.9% of Iceland's electricity comes from renewable sources, primarily hydro and geothermal power.
Fossil fuels are functionally extinct in their power grid.
Yes, that is almost mathematically perfect. And if you look at their total final energy consumption, which includes heating, transport, absolutely everything, renewable energy still accounts for 77 to over 80%.
So the ring chart is a monument to clean energy. But here's the problem for our designer.
What's the issue?
Next to that ring chart, the data requires a scatter plot mapping per capita CO2 emissions. And the data points hover around a stubbornly high 12 tons per capita.
Ah, this is the carbon paradox.
Wait, hold up. You want our listener to put a 99.9% clean grid on the left and a 12-ton per capita CO2 scatter plot on the right.
Yes, side by side.
If my grid is perfectly clean, how am I polluting that much? It feels like a massive data error. My audience is going to think I messed up the charts.
This raises an important question, right? Only if you assume the citizens are generating those emissions directly through daily living.
Okay, so where's it coming from?
We need to look at how Green Grid interacts with global industrial demand. Because their energy is so cheap, so abundant, and perfectly clean, Iceland attracts highly energy-intensive industries from around the world.
What kind of industries?
Right.
Like server farms?
Server farms, yes, but specifically aluminum smelting is the prime example.
Oh, wow.
Smelting aluminum requires a staggering amount of continuous electricity. It is incredibly expensive to do in countries relying on coal or natural gas.
So international companies bring raw bauxite to Iceland just to melt it down using Iceland's geothermal and hydropower.
Exactly. So the CO2 isn't from the citizens leaving their lights on. It's the industrial byproduct of exporting their cheap energy in the form of smelted aluminum.
So the emissions are basically imported along with the raw materials.
Exactly. The homes, the offices, and the domestic grid are perfectly green. But those specific heavy industries, along with the maritime and transport sectors required to move the materials, generate significant emissions.
I see.
Those sectors represent the final, incredibly difficult hurdles to reaching absolute net zero.
To resolve this paradox visually, without needing a whole paragraph of text, the scatter plot should probably have two distinct clusters of dots.
How would you arrange them?
One low, sparse cluster for domestic emissions, and one high, dense cluster labeled energy-intensive industry. It shows that the 12 tons per capita is a feature of their industrial export strategy, not a failure of their green grid.
That's brilliant. It clears up the confusion instantly. And it also highlights a critical element of trust.
Trust. How does smelting aluminum relate to trust?
An international corporation wouldn't build a multi-billion-dollar permanent infrastructure project like an aluminum smelter in a foreign country unless they implicitly trusted that country's local laws.
I hadn't thought of that.
They need absolute certainty that their assets won't be arbitrarily seized, that long-term energy contracts will be honored, and that the legal framework won't just change overnight.
Which brings us to the final piece of the data puzzle. The invisible bedrock of this entire system. We need to measure governance.
Crucial for any macro analysis.
For this slide, we need to show metrics that are basically maxed out. I'm suggesting horizontal box and whisker plots, or maybe a series of semicircle gauges where the needle is pinned entirely to the far right.
In global metrics compiled for governance, Iceland consistently ranks in the 90th to 99th percentiles for rule of law and control of corruption.
So the needle on the corruption control gauge is just jammed to the right side in solid slate gray.
Yes. And metrics for political stability and voice and accountability sit tightly in the 94 to 99% range.
And if you look closely at the data, the margins of error on these metrics are incredibly small. There's virtually no variance. They're consistently, predictably stable.
Which is exactly what foreign investors are looking for.
But I have to ask, as someone trying to tell an economic story, why does this really matter for a macroeconomic presentation? Why are we putting political and legal data next to GDP and aluminum exports?
Because it is the mechanism that allows everything else to function. It minimizes what economists call institutional friction.
Institutional friction.
Let's look at the alternative. When corruption is high, it acts as an invisible, unpredictable tax on every single transaction.
Right.
If you have to pay bribes to get permits, or hedge against sudden regime changes, or worry about courts failing to enforce a contract, the cost of doing business skyrockets, capital flees.
It makes the economy sluggish.
Yeah.
Every gear grinds.
Exactly. By maintaining a 99th percentile rule of law, Iceland makes its economy nearly frictionless. A safe, open, transparent society drastically lowers transaction costs.
It is the operating system that allows the high GDP, the aggressive foreign trade, and the high-value services to actually execute.
Without that transparency, the 100% trade-to-GDP ratio collapses. The foreign smelters leave, the tax base shrinks, the education funding dries up, and the positive feedback loop breaks.
It all comes tumbling down. So let's bring it all together for the final synthesis. You are building the concluding slide of this deck. You want to recap the logic we established at the very beginning with that continuous central axis.
The structural equation is clear, and you can almost write it out like a formula.
Right. Iceland's resilience equals its global trade integration.
Its extreme productivity equals relentless education spending combined with absolute gender parity.
Its unique sustainability model equals 100% clean power functioning within a framework of absolute legal transparency.
When you design this final summary, do not clutter it. The instinct will be to add a grand, sweeping 3D graphic. Don't do it.
Let the raw mathematical shock value of the data speak for itself. Put the jump from $14,000 to $60,000 GDP right next to the 99.9% clean energy metric.
Put the less than 2 per thousand infant mortality rate next to the 99th percentile corruption control.
Just lay the numbers out in crisp, dark typography on that pure white background. The math tells the story. You don't need drop shadows.
But as you finalize this presentation, consider the larger implications of the data you've just mapped out.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this the whole time.
We visualized a near-perfect positive feedback loop, a machine of human and economic optimization. But looking at these perfectly aligned charts, you have to ask yourself a deeper question.
Which is?
Is the Icelandic model actually an exportable blueprint?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Can a massive, highly heterogeneous nation of 300 million people look at your slides and apply these same rules to achieve the same results?
Or is this kind of structural perfection exclusively the privilege of an isolated, geothermally active rock in the North Atlantic?
Right, with a tiny, highly homogeneous population where the velocity of cause and effect is basically instantaneous.
That is the exact question your audience will be asking themselves when the projector finally turns off. Your job is to make sure the data is so clearly presented that they have absolutely no choice but to wrestle with it.
Good luck with the drafting process.
Yeah, good luck. Make it clean, make it dense, and let the geometry reveal the engine. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.